Well, good morning. Welcome to our visitors. Lovely to have you joining with us. We here at Katoomba Baptist are going through an expository series on the book of Deuteronomy, as the large screen above my head so elucidates for us. We obviously just recently returned coming out of Advent and Christmastide and the New Year break, and we've returned to chapter 11 where we currently are in, and today we are looking specifically at those verses which we just had read to us from chapter 11 of the book of Deuteronomy, and that is verses 8 through 12. We last week essentially just focused on one singular verse, which was verse 1. Much of the detail that then flowed forward in the 7 or 6 verses that came afterwards up to verse 7 were filling in the various details, many of which we've actually covered before. And the reason why I highlight that is because there is actually a similarity in this sense between that phenomenon last week as well as what we now have here before us today. You may have noticed that in the Old Testament reading earlier in the liturgy today, we had read from Deuteronomy chapter 8, which we haven't done before. We've never gone back and read something again from Deuteronomy, given the fact that we've already preached on that particular sermon, and I'm sure you'll be able to go back and find the contents contained therein. But in our case here today, the reason why we had that read was because the exact same point that Moses is herein making for us in chapter 11, he's actually already made back in those verses in chapter 8. And so part of what we'll be looking at here today specifically will of course be different in its view, not in the exegetical sense rather, but because of the fact that there is a particular phrase at the epicenter of our passage here, namely in the end of verse 9, which will serve as the axis upon which we're going to be looking and unpacking this rich text for us this morning. Other areas that will have been covered in that previous sermon from way back when we did it in chapter 8, you would be able to go back and listen to that sermon as well if you so choose. But today, these verses do revolve around this epicenter of the end of verse 9, as I suggested. And there are some very deep and rich concepts contained herein. Much of what we've seen in this book of Deuteronomy, of course, is about understanding these ancient words in the context in which they were given. We have herein again, to remind you, of course, this new generation of those who are predominantly speaking, at least the children of the generation that came out during the days of the Exodus. They have seen the rebellion of their parents, or even in some older cases, grandparents, and they are being warned and exhorted and encouraged and commanded by the great prophet Moses to walk in the righteous ways, to abide by the covenant of God, to remain steadfast and remain faithful to his word, etc., etc. And this repetition that we have here, which is one of the more notable examples in the book of Deuteronomy, Moses repeats plenty of concepts. However, to repeat the exact same point again should highlight for us that perhaps there is something significant to his reasoning as to why he might choose to do this. But a large portion of it is this foundational concepts that Moses is building in, almost in the sense of laying a foundation literally, for this new generation who will cross over into the wilderness. Cross over from the wilderness, into the land of Canaan. There are some historical details which we'll be touching on as well that inform one of our cross-references. There's a major cross-reference which we're going to have from Joel chapter 3, so the minor prophet Joel, and chapter 3 therein we'll be looking at one specific verse, but a very powerful and important verse for how we understand today's passage. So this is the structure of how we'll be proceeding forward for our time this morning. All right, so let's begin here in verse 8 of Deuteronomy 11 and work our way through from there. Verse 8 of Deuteronomy chapter 11. You shall therefore keep every commandment which I am commanding you today, so that you may be strong and go in and possess the land into which you are about to cross, to possess it. Now again, apart from chapter 8 and the original giving of this particular portion, we've seen this phrase so many times, okay? Keep every commandment. We've seen that already in this chapter. We've seen that in the previous chapters. In fact, we see it almost in every single chapter that we've had, especially from chapters 4 and 5 onward through our time here in Deuteronomy. Keep every commandment. So again, I'm not going to repeat necessarily the points that we've made so many times about this notion of keeping the commandments of God. However, there will be a flow forward into our primary section. But there is this directionality that Moses is again herein giving. He's not merely reminding the people to keep the commandments in an abstract sense or in a purely intellectual one. Instead, what he's doing is he is tying it down to history. In this case, the history that they're about to make. We've seen many times things of history past where they're called to recall back. In fact, there are actually words in the very next sentence which do just that. But here he is calling them to look forward. He is calling them to gaze their eye into the future and the purpose and the mission that lies before them, before God and before men, that they would indeed cross over, go into the land and possess it, that they would take dominion, that they would drive out demonic powers, that they would indeed conquer evil, and they would bring righteousness to this land that is described with a very seminal phrase, which we'll get onto just shortly in verse 9. But again here, this notion of keeping the commandments of God not merely on the individual level. We've touched on this many, many times. That is, of course, a rightful application, right? Personal piety. However, there is a much greater and grander aspect, right? Playing field, as it were, to which the covenant of God stands. And that is, of course, we as God's people. There is this communal aspect to the words herein being given. He is not speaking merely to individuals. He is speaking to a people, to the people of God. He is speaking to us in our unified mission to go forth in righteousness. And again, we've touched on many of the repetitious words of verse 8 so many times throughout our time here in the book of Deuteronomy. But continuing in verse 9, there is also an additional telos, an additional end, an additional goal to this mission, and that is, of course, verse 9, so that you may prolong your days in the land which the Lord swore to your fathers to give to them and to their seed. Now, before we finish off this verse, we have again seen this kind of phraseology a number of times. However, what is interesting for us in this particular context is the contexts, plural, in which we've actually found it previously. The most notable utilization of this phrase of that you're prolonging the days of the land in which the Lord your Father swore to your fathers to give them is actually most as heavily associated, of course, with the fifth commandment. Right? We covered this during our time in chapter 5 of Deuteronomy, and the fifth commandment, to honour your fathers and your mothers, that it may be well with you all the days of your life, and some translations again, that it may be well with you in the land in which you live. This notion of future blessing in the honouring of our fathers and our mothers, what we would say is our forefathers. Okay, and again, to remind you, it's not merely talking about your two biological parents. Your fathers and mothers is an extension all the way back, of course, very much in this keeping of this concept of our father Abraham, right? Our ancestors before us who have been in covenant with God. But in this case, tying it back to the beginning of our passage, verse 8, the keeping of every commandment, so the upholding and the maintaining of the law of God, the esteem of doing what is, capital G, good, is indeed directly linked, as we've seen so many times, with the prolonging of our days in the land. And this concept here, again, we've touched on, especially in the previous chapter 10, we saw a lot of that, heavily so, this particular concept, so please do consult those sermons if you would like to be reminded. However, he finishes with what is the epicenter, as I mentioned in the introduction for our time this morning. And it's this description, which is given in the end here of verse 9, a land flowing with milk and honey. Now, this particular phrase unfolds itself many, many times throughout the scriptures, particularly the aspect of the milk more than the honey, for reasons I'll explain just in a moment. But this phrase of a land flowing with milk and honey, or your translation in English might just simply say a land of milk and honey, is a very interesting phrase. It is one which was quite well known in the ancient Near Eastern world. The scriptures are not the only place where we find this particular phrase. We have a number of ancient Near Eastern documents which at least demonstrate that it was a well-known aphorism or a figure of speech, a land of milk and honey, as a symbol in a generic or general sense in the first particular instance of blessing, a land of milk and of honey, as opposed to all kinds of other things which would be utilised as stand-ins for curses. And it does come in with a context that we'll look at when we get onto it in verses 10 to 12. So we'll come back to that in just a moment's time. But to begin unpacking our understanding of what this milk and honey means, there is two primary aspects symbolically and figuratively in the scriptures in which this phrase is used. We're going to be focusing today on one of those. Okay, we don't have time to cover both. Really, it would require multiple sermons to unpack at least the full kind of plenary understanding for us from the entirety of scripture as to what this phrase means. The latter of these that we will not be focusing on is primarily around milk as a symbol for immaturity. Okay, in contrast often to how you especially see it in the New Testament authors, to that of meat or of solid food. Okay, so many times throughout the Old Testament we find the prophets chastising and admonishing the people for being like babes. Okay, suckling on the milk. Right, they are like infants spiritually, who do not grow up. Many of the prophets from Isaiah to Ezekiel to Jeremiah to many of the others do utilise this phrase, and it gets picked up, of course, by the apostles, especially the apostle Paul, but also the apostle Peter as well, in which they utilise the phrase in a contrasting sense, to no longer be like a babe weaning on milk, but rather to grow up into solid food. Okay, this notion of growth and spiritual maturity in this kind of symbolic sense. It would be a very interesting sermon to do, but because we find the phrase milk tied here, of course, most importantly, to the phrase milk and honey, we're going to be wanting to focus on the other aspect, which is of what milk and honey themselves, especially linked together, represent, okay, as we find it in this particular passage. And its most basic fundamental sense throughout Scripture, and really actually generally through ancient literature, milk and honey are utilised to symbolise a variety of different things. Blessing, as I mentioned earlier, in the generic sense, okay, kind of together taken as a symbol of blessing, but primarily and specifically, milk and honey being utilised, especially in the biblical context, for fruitfulness and for multiplication. Okay. In this case, honey being the byproduct of the work of the honeybee, it's a productive enterprise, or in this case, a productive byproduct, and its symbolisation of multiplication, okay, that's pardon me, of fruitfulness, is the reason why in ancient literature we find this utilised in such senses. So this notion going all the way back to Genesis of the command given to man to be fruitful and multiply, and this idea of blessing that God bestows upon his people of fruitfulness and multiplication, not only in the genetic sense, but really in all aspects of life, of goodness and of order, of the command to take dominion over the world, given, of course, to Adam, our forefather, etc., etc. We find that honey, throughout the ancient literature, and especially in the scriptures, is utilised to symbolise and to communicate the value and the meaning of fruitfulness, okay, of productivity, of increase, as well as then tied to that notion, of course, in this case, of milk, symbolising heavily that of multiplication. Milk itself, of course, coming in the context of childbirth and of new life, okay, in the animals and in us as people. Milk, therefore, is very naturally, especially in the ancient world, tied to the notion of multiplication and of life itself. Okay, so be fruitful and multiply. All of that kind of very deep, rich concept is actually herein tied up in the phrase of milk and honey. And so this notion of being fruitful, not only materially, but of course most importantly spiritually, and multiplying in the land, goes all the way back to those early chapters of Genesis. It flows its way forth, like proverbial rivers of milk and honey, through the promises of Abraham, wherein, of course, he, a tribal chieftain of what is a, at least comparatively speaking, small contingent, a small tribe, is told that his descendants shall be as innumerable as the stars in the heavens. There is this great multiplication, and indeed we've already seen in our time in Deuteronomy that Moses has described how the people here already are like the stars of the heavens, that they've already seen indeed this kind of fruitfulness and multiplication already. How much more so then will it come in the future, of course, is the implication. But they are called here to go into this land, and this phrase of milk and honey does indeed go back to Abraham and his time as well. But it's important for you to understand at least the basic building blocks of what symbolically this phrase means and how we are then to understand its utilisation, not only in this context, but then in others as well. Particularly, of course, for us, as I mentioned in the introduction, Joel chapter 3, which we'll get onto later on. But before we do, I want to continue through so that we then have the full context of verses 10, 11 and 12 to then see what, among many others, the prophet Joel has to say in this similar regard. So verse 10, "For the land in which you are entering into to possess it is not like the land of Egypt from which you came out, where you used to sow your seed and water it with your foot like a vegetable garden." This ending of verse 10 is actually quite difficult to translate in the Hebrew, so your English translation might say something different there. But I'm wanting you to see what he's building. He's drawing comparison here to the land of Egypt from whence they have come, comparing it to the land of Canaan into which they are now about to go. You used to have to sow your seed with water, and the phrase ultimately what it is meaning in the ending of verse 10, regardless of how we translate it into English, is this notion of arduous work. Okay, we find it in context that is similar to that in ancient literature, of this having to really work hard to produce something, harder than you would otherwise normally have to. Okay, the foot, watering it with your foot like a vegetable garden, is most likely a reference, given other contexts in which we find the phrase, to the fact that Egypt, of course, fertile along the Nile River, substantially lacked fertility the further out from the Nile River you, of course, went. For anyone who has been to Egypt, you'll understand that the Nile River is a most significant river, in fact, one of the most important rivers on earth, and certainly in human history and civilization, one of the most significant rivers. But as soon as you start walking away from that river, you realise that there is sand, and a lot of sand. And then as you crescendo the next hill, you find even more sand, and then beyond that, more sand again. Eventually you might come across a wadi, as it's known, or a kind of oasis, but generally speaking, you're looking at a whole bunch of sand and not much farmland. Right? Ancient Egyptian culture and civilization would have to build, and it did build, a very extensive irrigation system, okay, to be able to try and fertilise as much land around the watersheds of the Nile River, which of course seasonally flooded and provided water through the irrigation system for the farmlands of Egypt. But there was a lot of arduous city planning and development and architecture that went into trying to keep the farmlands around the Nile River fertile at the right times. Okay? And so this phrase we find in the context often of the irrigation system and of the work that would go into having to produce that. So why is Moses saying this? He's comparing the, at least relatively speaking, infertility of the land of Egypt, in the general broadest sense, of course, to the fertility, to the fruitfulness, literally, of the land into which they are about to go. Hence why he says then in verse 11, "But the land into which you are about to cross to possess it, a land of hills and of valleys, drinks water from the rain of heaven, a land for which the Lord your God cares. The eyes of the Lord your God are always upon it, from the beginning even to the end of the year." The land which you've come from has barrenness. And of course, this is an extremely important concept, not merely just in the kind of agricultural or agrarian sense, but barrenness as a central concept tying back into this notion of the seed. Of course, we think of examples going all the way back to Abraham and to his wife Sarah, and the centrality of barrenness that therein kind of features itself overall. We also then find barrenness as an important aspect as well that ties in. Interesting. Joshua, can you go and touch the screen? The screensaver, go on. in this case, sorry, to get back to my point, barrenness tying into Abraham and to Sarah and the notion of the seed. So I just unlock it. Apologies. Thank you. In this case of barrenness with Abraham and with Sarah, the point, of course, coming that throughout that barrenness, extending for 40 plus years, Sarah and her seed, or in this case lack thereof, was very central to the promise given to Abraham, that itself was working its way through time and history. And we actually touched just upon this in our Bible study through Galatians just last Monday. This notion of the seed, and ultimately what the Apostle Paul reveals therein is that the seed is Christ himself. He makes the point specifically in Galatians chapter 3 and verse 16 that the phraseology utilized in regards to Abraham is not seeds plural, though it should, as though it were many, to use Paul's words, but rather, quote, to your seed, that is Christ. Okay, for those who were there on Monday, you'll remember what I'm saying. Why is this so vitally important for us to understand? Because, of course, we see here this phrase of seed used in verse 10. We're finding the phrase seed again utilized in another example in verse 10 as well, right, where you used to sow your seed and water it. The seed itself being such a vital and central component going all the way back to Genesis. And the seed of the woman in contrast and in enmity to the seed of the serpent, and the fact that the seed of the woman would crush the seed and defeat the seed of the serpent itself. Why is this so vitally important for us to understand? Well, in this context we have for us in Deuteronomy 11, it ties to the notion of the land into which they're going, this land of milk and of honey. They have crossed out of and been redeemed from, literally, this barren land, barren especially so spiritually speaking from the symbolic perspective, a land of paganism, of darkness, of death, and of, as Moses so often refers to it, slavery, right? Both in the political and the spiritual sense, of course. They have wandered through the wilderness, they have wandered through equally barren land, facing all manner of dangers, and we've seen, at least in some of our broader references early on in Deuteronomy, when we've touched on parts of Exodus or Numbers particularly, that these instances in which God provided manna from heaven, in which, of course, he struck the rock, Moses, and water flowed forth. These great and wondrous signs during the time of Moses that obviously met the material needs of the people, but contained within them the seed, pardon the pun, of deepest spiritual truth and reality. That they're now going forth out of this barrenness, out of this lack of fruitfulness, into a land of milk and honey, into a land in which they will be fruitful and in which they will multiply and in which they will take dominion. They're crossing through the Jordan into this new land. And through there and from there, the arc of redemptive history will continue to march onward. And there's this operative phrase which comes as well to describe the hills and the valleys of this land of milk and honey, and it is therein in the end of verse 11, that it drinks water from the rain of heaven. Now, in the literal sense, of course, this is talking about from what we would say in modern English, the sky. Okay, we've explained this concept. In fact, we actually have seen this concept very recently of heaven and the highest heavens and the kind of hierarchy of the cosmos itself. In this particular case, there is actually a deeper level to our understanding of what this means. In the direct literal sense, it is talking about from the sky, right? Rain coming from the heavens, as we would say. But the directionality is very important. Again, these kinds of phrases are not used wantonly or flippantly by the prophet Moses. He's using them for specific reasons, especially because, keeping in mind, he's repeating a point that he's already made back in chapter 8 of Deuteronomy. This notion of the milk and honey, the land thereof, it is watered with rain from heaven, with heavenly rain, with divine rain. It is brought forth through and by the will of God, much as, of course, the water was brought forward from the rock when Moses struck it, as I just so mentioned. There is a source to this water. It is almost in many senses being paralleled, at least kind of typologically, with the manna from heaven. The bread did not come merely from the produce of man's work, but indeed there was this particular or this special aspect to it. In this particular case. It is watered from the rain of heaven. And so it's at this point that it's probably most appropriate for us to actually turn over to Joel chapter 3 and see how these elements of the milk, the honey, and the water all come to a crescendo for us in chapter 3 of Joel, so that we might better understand how it's being utilized back in chapter 11 of Deuteronomy. For context, for the sake of context, the book of Joel is an extremely important one, at least compared to its relative size. It punches far above its weight in regards to its application and its significance in relation particularly and especially to that of the New Covenant. Okay? This specific subsection of the book of Joel, which begins around verse 17, roughly speaking, of chapter 2, flows itself forward here into the ending of Joel chapter 3, which is verse 21, I believe. And you find therein one of the most prolific foretellings in this case, foreshadowings, of the New Covenant. In fact, Joel chapter 2 will most likely be familiar to you, if at all, in regards to the fact that the Apostle Peter quotes Joel chapter 2 on the day of Pentecost, this phrase of, and in the last days your sons shall prophesy and your women shall prophesy and the Spirit shall be poured out, to paraphrase. This section is that portion, okay? It's actually at the tail end here. And so this subsection of kind of the latter half of Joel chapter 2 all the way through chapter 3 is specifically about the New Covenant, okay, contextually speaking. For our application, we want to look specifically at verse 18, okay? So verse 18 of Joel chapter 3, which reads, God speaking, quote, "And it will be in that day," again speaking of this future time from Joel's perspective, what for us we now are part of, "It will be in that day that the mountains will drip like sweet wine, and the hills will flow with milk, and the brooks of Judah will flow with water. And a spring will go out from the house of the Lord to water the valleys of Shittim." Let's unpack this kind of sequentially. It will be in that day, as herein the great prophet Joel foretells of and looks forward to, the days of the New Covenant, that the mountains will drip like sweet wine. Now, his beginning, first and foremost, not only with sweet wine, but with the aspect of the mountain, is extremely important. We've seen many times and examined in relative depth the significance of mountains. Of course, much of our time in Deuteronomy has been focused on the law in those early chapters, as well as the history that had led up to that point through those first 4 chapters of Deuteronomy. We've seen the significance of mountains, that they are holy places. Okay, in the ancient world, including among the Hebrews, the mountain was the place in which God, or in the case of the pagans, the gods, resided. Of course, we find notable examples like Mount Olympus, for the Greeks perhaps most notably. We find the great pyramids of Giza, the land of Egypt, which we've had referenced already for us today. The great ziggurats of Babylon, these mountain-like structures, either actual mountains or man-made mountains, temples, often in the pyramidal form, Egypt, Babylon, etc., etc., that represent the high place, the place that is elevated above others, the place where the gods dwell, up there. Okay, and we've touched on many times that being the basis why, of course, mountains also likewise have such significance. Of course, the law of God is given where? On Mount Sinai. We find that indeed Jerusalem itself, the physical city, was located upon Mount Zion. The Mount of Olives plays its significant parts. Other places like Mount Carmel have great significance, especially in the days of Elijah, so on and so forth. In this case, the mountains will drip with sweet wine. It's fortuitous, it wasn't actually planned this way, it just providentially happened to align, where during our gospel reading from Mark, we have the famous reference to new wine, okay, to the wine skins that were given in that particular passage. This notion of sweet wines, in other words, good wine, fresh wine, right? Not wine that's gone off and wrong and is out of date, as we might say, but sweet wine that is fresh. It's new wine, okay? It is good wine, as the Bible would refer to it. This is the aspect that's being touched upon. And of course, wine we know of so directly in its significance with regards to sacrifice. Wine and its symbolism of blood is very evident for anyone with even an elementary understanding of the scriptures. But this is playing into the aspect that comes not only before it but also afterwards. The mountain is a place, as I mentioned, of the divine. It is a place in which God dwells, an elevated place. And it's why we see this concept of the mountain play itself forward as well in all of the typology that is given by the prophets in regards to the new covenant, as we would call it. Okay, perhaps most famously would be that of Daniel, the great prophet during the Babylonian exile, wherein in his work he gives this great prophecy of these four empires, these four great kingdoms that are represented through Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the statue. Okay, and you have the head of gold, you have the arms of silver, arms and torso of silver, you have the legs of bronze, and it flows itself forward from there. And what happens to that particular idol representing these great empires of ultimately Babylon, Persia, the Macedonians or the Greeks, and the Romans, is that it is smashed by a rock not carved with human hands. Okay, the implication being carved with divine hands. And that rock smashes that great idol of the imperial powers of the ancient world, the pagan powers, but it then grows into a great mountain that fills the whole earth. Okay, this is connected with other words, not only of Daniel but other prophets as well, including the minor prophets, in which words are spoken of rivers of living water flowing forward from this great mountain of God, and the birds of the air and the people of the nations ascend it in order to drink of its living water. Okay? All tying into this concept. Now, for those who were in our Bible study a couple of weeks ago where we looked at the whole concept of mountains and of trees and everything else, I encourage you, if you want to go and look on our resources for that particular Bible study which explains those concepts. But point being here is the notion of the mountain, the place of God, the holy place. It will flow forth and drip with sweet wine. The sacrifice and the emblem of sacrifice throughout the scriptures, that of wine, it will drip with it, okay? It will give plentifully of it. And also the hills will flow with milk. They will flow with that very same aspect which we saw back in chapter 11 and the ending of verse 9. That which, of course, is brought about by birth, it's brought about by new life. It itself is nourishing to the body. There is all of these aspects which we've been touching on tied herein. And finally, all the brooks of Judah will flow with water. So we have herein three concepts of sweet wine, milk, and water. Now, sweet wine is unique to this passage compared to ours in chapter 11. But we find therein also this aspect of milk and of water flowing, keeping in mind, of course, what we saw in Deuteronomy, that the land of milk and of honey is watered with what? Waters, in other words, the rain of heaven. All of these very deep, rich symbols of life, of multiplication, of fruitfulness, of blessing from heaven, particularly in the literal sense, are all being tied together here by the prophet Joel. That in those days of this new covenant, as we so call it, that indeed the mountains will drip with sweet wine. The fruitfulness, literally in the case of course, the grapes that bring about the wine, the fruitfulness that comes from that, as well as the blessings of sacrifice, namely, of course, the sacrifice of Christ. That the hills will flow with milk, that indeed the sustenance of God will be there, and that indeed the brooks of the water, so the brooks of Judah will flow with water, that which gives life, these rivers of living water, as Christ himself so utilizes that phrase most famously, picking up on the Old Testament references. It is not dead water, as the phrase often goes. Usually in English we translate it as bitter waters. This is salty water like you find in the Dead Sea or like you find in the oceans, okay? Not that which is being able to be drunk, right? But fresh waters, living waters, waters that bring life. And a spring will go out, as this passage, or this verse rather, resolves for us. A spring will go out from the house of the Lord to water the valleys of Shittim. Now it is so vitally important that we understand why this phrase ends the way it does, especially as it relates back to our passage. Okay? The Valley of Shittim, we know generally speaking where it is. We don't have the literal geo-coordinates, but we know the rough region in which it is. It's just north of the Dead Sea, on the eastern side, of course, of the River Jordan. Okay? It is, as you read through all the way through to the end of Deuteronomy, the last place that the Israelites encamp before they cross over the River Jordan. Okay? So in other words, by the time we actually get on to chapters 31 to 33 of Deuteronomy, the people will be in the Valley of Shittim. Okay? The phrase actually means the valley of acacia trees, okay, which were rather plentiful in that area. Okay? But the place is what is specifically important. It is the last place that the people are before they cross the River Jordan into the land of milk and honey. So there is an extremely important and vitally important aspect that we need to understand in regards to Joel. That herein he is saying that a spring will go out, in other words, it will flow forth from the house of the Lord, from the temple of God, and it will water, right, for a particular purpose, it will water the Valley of Shittim. It will cross back over the Jordan, so to speak, back into the land of Shittim. The very place on the eastern side of the Jordan, which was the last encampment. Here's how this starts to come full circle for us. Okay? There is a very foundational aspect when comparing the Old and the New Covenant, especially as we read them literarily, where the material in the Old Covenant or the Old Testament foretells and foreshadows typologically what is the spiritual in the New. Okay? Keeping in mind, of course, again, that Joel chapter 3 and this aspect which has been building up from the second half of chapter 2 is talking about the New Covenant. Okay, so we know, fortunately, the context in which it's being written. Right? He is looking forward gleefully and gladly to the days in which God would work in what we now call the New Covenant. That a spring would go forth, in other words, a river, right? A spring from the earth, living water, would go forth from a particular location to a location. From the house of the Lord, the temple of God, the place where God is and dwells, back into the land from whence they actually came, from whence they crossed over. There's an extremely important parallel in Ezekiel chapter 47. Now, I'm not going to obviously read the entire chapter, okay, but it takes up the preponderance of the chapter, the vast majority of this chapter, chapter 47 of the book of Ezekiel. To give you the summary of it, Ezekiel is brought to the temple. Of course, keeping in mind Ezekiel is living during the destruction of Jerusalem at the hands of the Babylonians, right, in which that very same temple would be destroyed. Earlier on in the book of Ezekiel, in Ezekiel chapter 10, there is this very important prophecy given wherein the glory of God, okay, the presence of God exits the temple, right, and leaves the temple to the east and dwells on the Mount of Olives in judgment of Jerusalem. Okay, Christ himself replays this event during the Passion Week, where he himself condemns Jerusalem, exits the east, goes to the Mount of Olives, and then gives what we call the Olivet Discourse. But nevertheless, we eventually work our way up to chapter 47, and despite the condemnation, a prophecy of hope is given in chapter 47, which is right at the end, okay, of the book. I believe off memory Ezekiel has 48 chapters, if my memory serves me correctly. Okay? So right at the very end, as he is giving these words, much like Isaiah does, looking forward to the new covenant in which God would restore things. And what he says is this: the angel of the Lord brings him to the temple, and there is a spring of water coming out of the temple. It's coming out of the east, it's flowing out of the south, to the north. There's this omnidirectional language utilized. And it flows specifically eastward, okay? And this angel of God carries Ezekiel forward, and they go X amount of cubits, what is ultimately about 500-yard intervals, okay? So 500 yards at a time, they move. Initially, the river in the place that they begin is, of course, just around the feet, right, at the temple. It's this small trickle. Then as they proceed forward, it reaches ankle height. And then as they proceed forward again, it reaches knee height. As they proceed forward once more, it reaches waist height, until eventually they are over 2 kilometres, what would be for us 2 kilometres away from the temple. Right? They're a far distance by this particular point. And it is now a raging river, right? A deep river. And this incredibly deep imagery is given throughout that chapter, which you would need to read to get the full sense of it. The trees are growing on the banks of this great river, and it is fruitful, and they're producing great fruit. And the birds of the air come to gather its fruit and to dwell in the trees. It's a similar reference to what I made earlier with the birds of the air coming to the great mountain of God, etc. And the people are able to eat of the fruit of these trees and drink of this living water, as it's called. And it goes forth out into the sea. Okay, so the opposite of living water, what would be called bitter waters in the Bible, right? Salty, as we would say. They don't produce life. Okay, they can contain life, but they don't nourish us. We can't drink it. It's dead water in that sense. That's why we call it the Dead Sea, after all. And it transforms those waters. They're no longer dead water or no longer bitter waters, to use the more common reference. The living water flows forth and transforms the seas. There are small marshes and swamps, as it refers to toward the tail end there, which remain, okay? And there nothing lives or grows is the phrase off memory that is utilised, right? But all the rest of the sea that it flows out forward into, the geographical image is actually the Red Sea, because it goes forward through a particular valley in that particular text, so it's hearkening all the way back to the Exodus itself, right? But nevertheless, it produces life. And the living water flowing forward from the temple of God transforms that dead water, the seas, constantly a symbol of the pagan world in the Old Testament, and brings new life. Why is that so significant? Why is that so important? Why does that help us understand Joel chapter 3 and, more importantly, Deuteronomy chapter 11 verses 8 to 12? Because all of these concepts tied together give this most profound image, this incredible typos, or this particular symbolism. And that is of fruitfulness, that is of living water, life itself, flowing forward from the place where God dwells, out into the nations. This is what Ezekiel is foretelling of this water which flows forward from Zion, which flows forward from the temple of God, and goes out into the great seas of the world and transforms that dead or that bitter water into living water. There is new life, and trees spring forth, and people gather on the banks and eat of the fruits of it. Much, of course, as you would with vineyards, much as, of course, you would with the grapes and the sweet wine thereof produced. This is what Joel himself is speaking of in this very short form compared to the much lengthier chapter of Ezekiel. We get, in this very instance, the exact same concept. That a spring will go out from the house of the Lord, the temple of God, in order to water the valley of Shittim. It will cross back over the Jordan. It will exit and flow forth out of the land of milk and honey, and it will bring the same fruitfulness and blessing back out to the nations. Hence why Shittim, the valley of Shittim, is referenced. The last place east of the Jordan in which the Israelites encamped in those ancient times. Of course, we know and have seen so many times throughout Deuteronomy, as we've then incorporated that with our various other cross-referential texts, that Christ himself, who, as I mentioned earlier, funnily enough, is the seed to whom Paul references, has inherited the nations. That he himself now has authority over all heaven and all the earth. That indeed now, as he said to the Samaritan woman at Jacob's well, that no longer will God be found on that mountain or on this mountain or in this fixed place. But indeed, the days are coming and have now arrived in which God is seeking those who will worship him in what? Spirit and in truth. And he says to the Samaritan woman that from them shall flow forth rivers of living water. This water, to paraphrase, right, Jacob's well, very famous place, provides you water and sustenance for but a day. But I will bring forth living water, and he who drinks of it will have eternal life. For indeed now the people of God, not only individually but collectively, corporately, we are the temple of God. We are the dwelling place of the Holy Spirit, who in ancient times dwelt singularly and in isolation, now dwells collectively through us all. Indeed, from the house of the Lord flows forth rivers of living water that go out to the valley of Shittim, that go out to the nations, just as the gospel has indeed done for thousands of years. What is the physical in the old covenant typologically foretells of the spiritual in the new. This land of milk and honey, not in isolation but by virtue of God's blessing and of God's providence and of his provenance, is the very same that now flows forth, as both Joel and Ezekiel foretell of, out into the places where the bitter waters of the nations, of the pagans, is transformed by that living water that is transformed by the living water of the gospel, the living water of Christ himself. Indeed, the one who is that living water from heaven, as the land, in the case of Deuteronomy 11, is so described as being watered by rain of heaven. Understanding these concepts is how we then see and understand our place as well in the new covenant. It's how the church has understood its place. The early church and the medieval church did a very good job on the whole of understanding these concepts, especially as pagans converting into the faith. They understood and saw what these things meant. That indeed everywhere that the kingdom of God goes forth, so too does the Lord who inhabits it. That he himself is ultimately the great temple. He is literally in his humanity the very ark of the covenant. He is the ultimate ark in which the divinity of God, in which the divine essence, in which God himself dwells bodily. Everywhere that he and his gospel and his kingdom go, it too is transformed. It too becomes, under his dominion, a land of milk and honey. Through the blessing of God, through the watering, through the dripping of the sweet wine, the sacrifice, the blood of Christ, it is transformed from death into life. And this indeed is how Moses too, like the prophets that would come after him, is speaking in his time that then itself foreshadows that which is to come. That all tying in this notion of the keeping of the commandments, the covenant of God, tying back to the land sworn to our fathers, in this case our father Abraham, a land flowing with milk and honey that drinks water from the rain of heaven. Now indeed, in this great reversal of the curse, as indeed we go forth, the great carol speaks, that the gospel of God goes forth where all the curse is found. Where that curse of sin is, new rivers of living water flow forth. This is all of the brilliant imagery that is utilized by God throughout Scripture to demonstrate in the deepest sense the great redemption that he brings, the transformation of the world, the reversal of the curse sown in its seed form all the way back in Eden. That too, like in that garden that was in Eden, 4 rivers flowed forth from it to the corners of the earth in that symbolism, so now in this new Garden of Eden, which is the church, which is the place where God dwells, rivers of living water likewise flow forth. I encourage you to listen to the Bible study given not last week but the week before, where we touched on all these concepts. If you want me to specifically show you where it is or help you find it, I can do that after the service. Much of the concepts which we've seen today are explained actually therein, and it would be helpful for you to watch that and go back and listen to it. But for us here to round up, to understand what is being told to these Israelites here that they would do, that indeed they would be the next step, the next stage in this great redemptive work of God. And we, now here in the new covenant, are the great inheritors of the work that God was herein doing. And so we look back on it in not merely homage, but in honouring of their work and in honouring of God, who continued to bring about his great plan of redemption. That we ourselves are the beneficiaries of this rain from heaven. And that indeed the gospel itself, as it goes forth in the kingdom of God and of its expansion, transforms the world into a land of milk and of honey. Amen.